Hello foiling friends, Lake Powell friends, I am Jeremy Byram. You may also call me Byromi. This video has been long in the works, not so much the videoing itself, but rather my personal journey and learning experience of all these different wings. I started eFoiling and foiling in general about 2 years ago, and this year is the first year that I introduced these additional wings beyond these two that you see down here of the Waydoo Flyer 1. These larger ones up here are for the Foil brand or Foil Incorporated or GetFOIL.com. We're going to talk about a few complementary topics, starting with how every wing will have an individual personal experience for every rider. We'll also talk about how you can take various steps to improve your experience with each individual wing. Every wing will have an experience and ride as different as the wings look. It is quite an amazing thing. Possibly the biggest takeaway I want you to have from this video is how every wing is going to potentially be a very individual experience. And that's going to be based on 5 things. First, the rider weight. Second, your skill. Third, your style, which also has some individual things about style, depending on how fast you want to ride, or if you want to be carvy or surfy, or if you want to explore. Fourth, the water and weather conditions. And the fifth is kind of like style, but it's still separate. And that's going to be your previous water sports, board sports, and even your previous foiling experience, and how all those things will influence your experience with every wing. E-foiling and wings is not a monogamous relationship. You can love more than one. You can have more than just one. I enjoy every one of these wings, and I have learned something about and from each and every wing. And I feel like I continue to do so. And so the second big thing I want you to take away from this video are the things you personally can do to improve your experience with your wing or wings. There are 3 things you can adjust and experiment with. The first is your stance, the second is your speed, and the third thing is just patience and time. So going to your stance, there are several different directions that you can adjust your stance. And as you are playing with and experimenting with different stances, you want to change it simply just by an inch at a time or so. And you can adjust it lengthwise, forward and back. You can also adjust your stance toe side and heel side as well, or a combination of all of the above. I personally, when I ride, I use a stance that is heel heavy on the front and toe heavy on the back. But on some wings, I might bring them a little bit more in the middle, down the center line of the board. And also some wings I will ride a little wider, some a little more narrow. And some wings I'll ride further back, and some wings further forward, or a combination of all those things. So these are all different things you can play with. You can adjust just your front foot or adjust your back foot, forward, backward, toe side, heel side, etc. Small adjustments will make a big change on any and every eFoil and every wing, and will help you to pinpoint and narrow down the balance that is necessary for you and your style and your size and all those things discussed in the first topic. Speed is something that will be determined on how comfortable you are, if you are a beginner or not. So I like to suggest having one speed level higher than your comfort flying speed. And if you're not ready to have additional speed to play with in the trigger, that's fine. You can do that later. I personally set the speed at a certain speed, and I mashed the trigger for several days until I was ready to feather and adjust the speed with my finger on the trigger. Some people will be ready to do that from day one. So when you are ready and you're comfortable, I suggest adding at least one increment higher than your comfort zone. And what this is going to do, this is going to give you a little bit of play in your acceleration as you go into turns. Is going to help you to recover potentially from some turns or some dives in different scenarios. I'm going to pause here for a moment to point out that if you are learning to foil for the first time and you begin to lose your balance, you want to go with the fall. You want to fall away from the board, fall away from the foil and the mast and all of that equipment to fall safely and properly. Once you begin to get the feel of flying and some turning, then you can consider learning to recover from some small imbalances. And then patience and time, just realizing that every wing is very different. And this personal experience was probably the biggest eye-opener, the biggest mind-blowing experience for me. So when I started writing my foil by GetFOIL.com, I switched to this wing quite early in the season because it was entirely different than anything else. And the foil is entirely different from the Waydoo. After riding this wing for the entire late winter and the spring, I went back to the Waydoo riding this wing that I had been comfortable riding with for an entire year. And suddenly I was no longer comfortable riding it. It took me about 5 rides to get comfortable riding that wing again in the same way that I was riding it before, at the same speed and feeling like I was carving the same way as I was carving before. So this was the biggest mind-opening experience, that adjusting back to what I thought was comfortable took me that long. So it may take you, like me, multiple times to adjust even to wings that you think you were comfortable with before. So all through this spring, summer, and fall, I've been switching between all of these wings and all of my gear to try to improve my ability to identify with and build a relationship with and familiarize myself with the wings so it would not take me 5 rides or even 3 rides. Now I've gotten to the point that I feel like I can adjust to each of these wings by the end of the first ride. And so if you're someone who has a lot of foiling experience, there's a higher chance that you'll be able to jump on a totally different wing and be able to build enough of a understanding of it in the first ride to judge it with more clarity, even for yourself, let alone someone else. And so when I get to the review at the end of this video, it's very subjective based on all these things. It's subjective to me. You may have the exact same experience. You may have a totally different experience. Everyone is different. Every wing is different. So I weigh 170 pounds. I am 6 feet tall. And my skill, I would say, is intermediate to advanced. I have 2 years of eFoiling experience, which is heavily influenced by my previous experience with one-wheeling, which is my main board sport, and wakeboarding, my main water sport. I also have some other water sports experience and some other board sports experience, but it's mostly wakeboarding and one-wheeling. And one-wheeling I like to call my land foil now after eFoiling, because one-wheeling is the closest thing you can get to eFoiling on land. Anyway, I digress. And as far as water and weather conditions, I'm in beautiful Lake Powell. I'm on a lake. That's me. So you can compare that to yourself. It may or may not influence your own decision. Everyone's different. So what is this word high aspect, or high aspect wings, or high aspect ratio? This is a term that you're going to see a lot in hydrofoils and comes from aerofoils or aviation, because a lot of hydrodynamics and aerodynamics share similar traits and come from fluid dynamics. So the term high aspect ratio, often abbreviated as HA, comes from the ratio of the length of the wingspan over the width of the chord, or the wing width. And this is specifically in regards to more rectangular wings, as you see with some of the airplanes. But these wings are not rectangular, so a more mathematical way of determining the aspect ratio is going to be the wingspan, the length, squared divided by the surface area. Now you'll see this number down here, 250. That is the surface area from the top view of the wing in inches. Other brands will use centimeters. So if you're looking at a brand such as Flightboard, for example, they will have a number closer to the thousands as they're using centimeters. In aviation, planes that need to be agile and responsive have a low aspect ratio, such as fighter planes or stunt planes, or something like the classic wing. Gliders, on the other hand, will have a high aspect ratio of at least 6 or higher, such as this 200 high aspect wing, which has a very long but narrow wingspan. This gives it a lot of glide and a lot of efficiency. So these are the two different types of aspect ratios, low and high, and then you have wings that are going to be mid aspect ratio in the middle. The classic 165 has a wingspan of 25.5 inches and a chord or a wing width of 9.6, giving it a low aspect ratio of 4. The 200 high aspect wing has a wingspan of 37.6 inches and a wing width of 7, giving it a ratio of 7. The 250 high aspect wing, on the other hand, I would actually consider more of a mid aspect ratio and has a wingspan of 35.25 inches, which is more than 2 inches shorter than the 200. It is also wider at 9 inches, giving it an aspect ratio of 5. The 165 at 4, the 200 at 7, and the 250 at 5. Generally speaking, the higher the aspect ratio, the greater the efficiency, and the lower the aspect ratio, the greater the maneuverability. Also, the surface area, the greater the surface area, the more lift there is going to be, and the lower the surface area, it'll usually be faster as well, such as the racing wing, which is a 100 surface area. And the same applies to the stabilizer or the rear wing. Sometimes they're known as a stab for short. You have the front or main wing, and then you have the rear stabilizer. The same rules apply for the stabilizers, and you can see that each one is just a bit different, which will also have an influence on the overall ride. The job of the rear wing stabilizer is to help control pitch, the movement of the wing up and down in this motion here. Here we're looking specifically at the stabilizers of each wing. The 250 has the longest wingspan, and the 200 has the shortest wingspan. Larger stabilizers will have more lift and will be more stable, but at the sacrifice of drag. One last term I'd like to talk about is winglets. So this is the classic 165, and you will notice that the wingtips turn up or turn down. And in aviation, whenever you have turned up wingtips, whether they turn up abruptly or if they're more continuous and gradual and blended, such as these blended winglets, the purpose of these is to help improve efficiency and also to help improve longitudinal control, which is the roll of the wing in this direction. So they do add some tracking and make it a little bit more efficient and stable. Allow me to use my foil board to demonstrate the stance that I personally use for each of my wings. You might be different, but you might find something helpful from what I have to share. I am naturally goofy-footed or right foot forward. And let's talk about the 200 high aspect wing. So for the 200 high aspect wing, my stance is further back than any of the other wings. My back foot is going to be fairly close to the toe side edge of the pad, and it's going to be almost on top of the latch. And then my front foot is going to be toeing the line of the hinges up here, like this. Also, I tend to use a bit more of a wakeboard stance with the 200 high aspect wing than the other wings. That's definitely my wakeboard background coming in, so almost sometimes even my back foot ends up being slightly ducked. So that's the stance that I use that I feel helps me the most to control the 200 high aspect wing. My front foot will also be a little bit closer to center, where the heel is further from the edge than the toe is from the edge over here. Because when I ride, I find that I tend to recover easier from the toe side corner dipping in the water versus the heel side. And to counteract that, I've moved my stance slightly overall toe side heavy, so that when I do dip down on the heel side edge, I'm not going to dig as deep into that edge and slow down and fall as I would otherwise. So that's kind of one of my thought processes here for changing my stance, and something you can use as well. One of the recommendations I've given to a few people who are trying the 200 wing is to bring your stance, if it's already wide, if you already have a stance where you have your feet on the edges of the pad like this, which is generally recommended for beginners, to actually move your feet slightly toward the center line down the middle of the board. Now, this almost seems counterintuitive. It's going to make you yourself a little bit less stable on the board, but it's going to force you to make more gradual turns and adjustments on the ride and the wing. And as I mentioned earlier, the 200 high aspect wing is like a glider. It needs to ride more mellow speeds, mellow transitions into turns, and having your feet a little bit closer to the center line is going to help to ensure that you're doing that. And then once you get a little bit more comfortable with the feeling, you can potentially move your feet to a different spot for riding when you get a little bit more comfortable and advanced. If I'm riding at a particularly slow speed, this is when I'm riding at, say, level 9 or 11. Those are the speeds that I like to ride. But if you're riding at a slow speed, you may need to adjust everything forward. And this is in regards to any and every wing, which is why I have this pad put up here. It's beneficial. I'll make a separate video about that. So if you're going particularly slow, you'll actually need to be all the way forward like this. And then once you get more up to speed, then you can bring your feet back. All right, so let's talk about the 250 wing. So the 250 wing, my foot is practically in the same spot, maybe a little bit further forward, not quite on the latch, and it's close to the edge of the board. And then my front foot is going to be actually way up here on top of the hinge line, pretty much like parallel with the 45-degree angle of the black pad there. And so I have a much wider stance with the 250 wing. I'm 6 feet tall, so this is pretty comfortable for me. Maybe not everyone will necessarily need a wide stance, so if you're shorter, it may or may not be a problem. Again, every wing, every person hits, you're gonna have a totally different experience. Also, another great thing about the 250 wing is it has some other applications of being able to take maybe your son or your daughter for a ride, and they can sit on this pad. I'm giving away my future video here. I'm also going to be doing a future video about these shoes and whether or not you might consider wearing shoes in a video. So please do subscribe and like and all that stuff. Give me motivation and props and all that. Oh, and the classic wing. The classic wing is basically a blend between the two of these stances. My back foot's going to be right at that corner there. This corner of the pad that my foot's stepping on. And my front foot's going to be just barely over the line or so. So it's kind of like in between, bit of a blend. So just experiment with your stance. Experiment with having your feet more down the center line, having your feet in a square at each of the edges, further forward, further back, and just all that stuff. But make tiny adjustments, 1 inch at a time for each foot, or 1 foot at a time. Something that can help determine how balanced you are on your board is actually when you breach, whether you do it on accident or whether you do it on purpose. Depending on how comfortable you are and how advanced you are, you may or may not want to do breaches on purpose. And breaches when the board elevates to its highest possible level and still maintain power and lift so that the propeller is basically churning on the top of the water. And if you're going to do this on purpose, then you need to take it real slow, mellow, just slowly bring the board up. But basically when you breach, you're at your highest point. Your balance is going to be put to the test. And if your balance is off, you're going to quickly know where it's off. If the board veers to the right, then you have too much weight on the right, or just the way that your body is positioned is too much to the heel side. Likewise, if you veer to the toe side, you probably have too much weight on the toe side. If you tend to fall out the front and the nose dips really hard, then you have too much weight in the front. So all of these things you can adjust based on the reactions you get when you breach. Pausing again here briefly, specifically for those who are first-time eFoil writers. This purpose breach technique is part of what I call advanced touch and goes, which is another thing I'll be covering in greater detail in a later video. I recommend that you get comfortable with flying and some turning before doing this purpose breach technique. Regardless of what wing or board or whatever you ride, live life to the foilest.